Okay, here's tonight's video, section 1.3, Introduction to Experimental Design. No need to take notes on this slide. I just want to make sure you know we're going to be discussing what it means to take a census. We'll be describing simulations, observational studies, and experiments. We'll talk about control groups, placebo effects, how to completely have a randomized experiment, and also randomized block experiments. And then we'll discuss potential pitfalls that might make your data unreliable. Okay, so looking at planning a statistical study, there's a lot that goes into this, as you'll see from this slide here, right? But for the moment, we're going to focus on the first three aspects. Okay, so we'll be looking at identifying individuals or objects of interest, specifying the variables and the protocols for taking measurements and making observations, and then determining if we're using an entire population or a representative sample. If it's a sample, then we're deciding on what the most appropriate sampling method might be. These are all things that we've started to talk about in Chapter 1. As you look further into the list, we'll be spending more time on these other points in upcoming chapters. Again, this is just so you understand where we are. No need to take notes on this particular slide. Okay, here there are a couple of notes to take. We want to make sure we understand what a census is versus a sample. So if we're talking about a census, like think about the U.S. Census, surely you've heard about that in your history classes. Here we're taking measurements or observations from an entire population. We're getting information from everyone or everything of interest. Okay? Whereas in a sample, as hopefully you appreciate by now, we're only getting information from part of the population. Okay, so you just grab that information in yellow there, and we'll continue on. When we're developing our study, we need to be clear about whether we are doing an observation or an experiment. So we have a couple of notes to capture here in the yellow section. Okay? If it's an observational study, then we are not doing anything to the people or objects. We're just kind of watching. We're seeing what happens. So we're not affecting them in any way. We're just observing and taking measurements. Okay? So this might be if we're out in the wild and we're looking at the lions and we're trying to understand lion behavior. We're not doing anything to the lions. We're just watching, we're monitoring, we might be gathering data, but in no way are we affecting lion behavior. Right? That's different from an experiment. Okay? If we're doing an experiment, then there's some sort of treatment that we're deliberately imposing on the individuals or the objects in order to see if there's a possible change in the response or the variable being measured. Okay? So this might be if we're trying to test a new drug, right? We would give some number of people or animals, we can talk about that and debate about ethics and whatnot, but we would give some sort of life form the drug that we're interested in testing and see what their response to that drug is. So now we're doing something to the individuals. We're not just looking at them, we're doing something and then seeing what effect it has on them. Now, interestingly, when we're talking about experiments, there's something known as the placebo effect. You may have heard about it before. So if you have an individual who's taking part in a study, they may not be receiving the treatment, but they might think simply by being part of the study that something is happening to them, and they might respond favorably based on that belief. So for example, if we're doing a study about a new medication, to test the effects of the medication, we might give half of our study participants the actual drug and the other half nothing. This is very common practice. The half that doesn't receive the drug, they might think they're getting it and start to feel better, even though they have no drug in their system. They're just getting, a sugar pill of some sort. That's what's called the placebo effect, when you're not getting a treatment but incorrectly believe that something favorable is happening anyways. Now, when we're doing the experiment, we need to be able to compare the results of the treatment group, those that received the particular treatment. Let's say it was a drug that we're testing. We need to be able to compare that to the results of the control group. Those are the people who did not receive the treatment, did not receive maybe the special drug we're testing. When we are looking to do this, we want to have ideally a completely randomized experiment. Okay, this is one in which we're using a random process, like a random number generator table as we used in class, to determine who goes into the treatment group and who goes into the control group. Now here's an interesting result of an actual experiment that was conducted. They took patients with chest pain, they randomly assigned them into two groups, okay? One that was getting the treatment, so the treatment group here, the other that was not getting the treatment. So this was the control group here. Okay, so we have the control group here. I know the writing is terrible. And we have the treatment group here. If I can figure out how to write better in these, I will. All right, so, and then after the treatment, after those who were in the treatment group had laser holes in their heart, and the ones who were in the control group, they had no laser holes, though they were subject to a surgery. They just didn't get the holes in their heart. Then they look and compare the pain relief of the treatment group participants versus the control group participants. Interestingly, in this particular study, the placebo effect was particularly strong because those who were in the control group actually showed more improvement in pain relief. Go figure. Nothing had actually been done to them, but their belief was so strong that they were going to be better, that they actually were better somehow. This is an unusual result and actually one that's still being investigated. So when we're doing a study, we already established there's a control group. Okay, this is the group that receives the dummy treatment, maybe the sugar pills instead of the actual medication. And this allows the researchers to try to control for that placebo effect, right? They're able to see how much better is the actual treatment group than the control group, even if the control group has some sort of placebo effect. Okay. This also allows researchers to control for other variables, which we call lurking or confounding variables. These may be other factors that might influence the result that we use individuals who aren't getting the treatment and individuals who are getting the treatment helps us to find these out. Okay. Again, it's important that we are using randomization. We're randomly assigning people to the control group and the treatment group. There's no bias as to who goes into what group. And then replication. We want to be able to replicate the study under similar conditions so that we're sure that the results of any one particular experiment didn't happen by chance alone. Okay. Notice double-blind studies. This is an interesting approach and something you want to capture in your notes. One way to ensure that we control any strange effects is by making sure that neither the individuals in the study nor the observers know who is in the treatment group and who is in the control group. So I'll let you think about why that might be a good idea. We can talk about that more in class. Okay, the last topic for this video has to do with surveying. So once we know whether or not we're using sampling or census, observation or experiments, then we need to figure out how we're gathering data. And a common way to do that would be by surveying people, right? Asking them questions. So here, there are a couple ways we can do this, right? We might ask them simple questions, questions that have as a possible response simply yes or no. Yes or no, sorry, can't quite show that because I can't seem to delete the blue circle there. Or we might have individuals choose to respond on some sort of scale. So you've seen these before, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And maybe we have them rate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where 1 is strongly disagree, 2 is disagree, 3 is neutral, 4 is agree, 5 is strongly agree, right? So we're applying some sort of number. When we use a scale like that, that's called a Likert scale, where we have some number of choices, and then there's, strongly disagree. I find the writing here funny. All the way up to strongly agree. Okay, that's called a Likert scale. It's a common way of surveying people. All right. When we might be doing open-ended or discussion type responses, we still usually need to convert those responses into some sort of category or number. So if we're not having the people decide what number, we might have to translate open-ended responses to come up with a category for their response. All right. Okay, so last slide here. When we're doing surveying, there are a lot of pitfalls we have to be on the lookout for, okay? We might have individuals who choose not to respond, right? And that can mean we end up with an undercoverage of our population. We talked about undercoverage in the last video, okay? We might find that individuals are not telling the truth, right? Maybe the truth would make them look bad in some way, so they don't want to tell us the truth. There might be an issue with recall. Perhaps they just can't recall specific information, and that might throw off the results. Okay. Hidden bias. All right. If we ask a question in a particular way, it might encourage individuals to answer in a particular way, and we'll look at some examples of that in class tomorrow. If we're too vague in our wording, right? Do you often go to the store? Well, what does often mean, right? That could be up to interpretation. That could negatively affect our survey results. If we are too much indicating our own belief about an issue, right? So if we ask a question of somebody at the grocery store and we say, you don't really think there should be gun control, do you? Now, obviously, that would influence an individual's response if they were tempted to agree with us. So we have to be careful about how we exert our own influence. Okay? And lastly, voluntary response, right? We have to recognize that people who have strong feelings about a subject are more likely to respond. So for example, the survey we do in school where we ask parents for their input, right? We make that voluntary. So we'll discuss tomorrow what parents are more likely to respond to that and how might that affect the survey results. Okay, that's it for tonight. We'll see you tomorrow.